Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a geopolitical earthquake that has literally completely upended centuries of strategy. We're talking about Finland and Sweden making the absolutely monumental decision to abandon their long-held neutrality. You see, for generations, the delicate balance of power in Northern Europe was maintained by a very specific, carefully managed status quo. But recently, well, that all came crashing down. To discover why this is such a profound, catastrophic shift for Russian foreign policy, we need to understand the geography and the history that's kept military planners in the Kremlin awake at night for hundreds of years.
Okay, let's dive into this. 150. Keep that number in your head. That is the distance, in kilometers, from the Finnish border to the city of St. Petersburg. To put that into perspective for a second, St. Petersburg is Vladimir Putin's hometown. It's Russia's second-largest city, home to over 5 million people, and it accounts for nearly 5% of the entire Russian economy. And it sits less than 150 kilometers away from what is now a newly minted NATO border. Finland has always had the geographic proximity to seriously threaten Russia's crown jewel city.
Section 1. The 800-mile border threat. Russia's vulnerability. Now, that proximity to St. Petersburg is really just the beginning of the geographic nightmare for Moscow. Finland shares an 800-mile border with Russia. That's the second longest border Russia shares with any European nation. And we're not talking about a wide open plain here. This border cuts through incredibly thick forests and deep snow across what is basically a massive no-man's land where hardly anybody actually lives. Those 800 miles are virtually impossible to comprehensively patrol or monitor, and they are even harder to actually defend.
Section 2. A history of survival. Geographic realities. Now, despite this incredible geographic advantage, Finland hasn't historically been able to threaten Russia on its own. Why? Well, it all comes down to manpower. Today, only about 5.5 million people live in Finland. That's roughly the population of St. Petersburg alone, while Russia has about 27 times more people overall. So the real fear for Moscow has always been that Finland might ally with a powerful foreign enemy. That would allow massive external armies to enter the country and exploit that 800-mile border. And that exact fear? It has driven Russian strategy for centuries.
It's fascinating when you trace this timeline back and see how Russia has historically managed this vulnerability. Back in 1808, terrified that the British Royal Navy might use Swedish and Finnish ports, Russia invaded Finland, which was controlled by Sweden at the time, specifically to push the border hundreds of kilometers away from St. Petersburg. Fast forward to 1917, Finland gains independence, but the tension is still there. By 1939, Stalin is worried about a Finnish alliance with Nazi Germany, so he demands a buffer zone. Diplomacy fails, and the Soviets invade with 500,000 soldiers. This becomes the infamous Winter War. The Finns fought fiercely, inflicting 320,000 casualties compared to their own 70,000. But ultimately, they had to give up about 9% of their territory. So, after World War II, Finland realizes just how precarious their position is. They adopt a stance of strict political neutrality throughout the entire Cold War, organizing their society around this fanatical policy of total defense to deter any future attacks, all without directly joining a Western alliance.
Section 3. The breaking point. The end of neutrality. For literally decades, this careful dance worked, even after the Soviet Union collapsed, and even after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. Finnish support for joining NATO hovered around just 22%. But that changed overnight in February 2022. By launching an all-out invasion of Ukraine with 200,000 soldiers, Russia massively escalated geopolitical tensions and completely shattered centuries of careful diplomacy in just a matter of months.
So, what does this all mean? The crucial takeaway here is simple. The calculus of risk was changed irreparably. Finland, a country that had been invaded by Russia in the past and wasn't under direct NATO protection, just watched a similar non-NATO country get invaded. To the Finns, Russia suddenly looked unpredictable, maybe even irrational. If Moscow was willing to risk everything in Ukraine, what was stopping them from moving on Finland again? Staying neutral was simply no longer a viable security strategy.
And make no mistake, Finland is bringing a terrifying amount of firepower into the NATO alliance. Due to their relentless total defense policy and mandatory conscription, which, by the way, 73% of Finns still support, Finland wields around 1,500 artillery and rocket systems. That is more than the United Kingdom. They have around 1 million men in the reserves. That's nearly a fifth of their entire population, and it's more reservists than Germany, France, and Italy combined. Plus, they boast more main battle tanks than Germany, a country of 83 million people. It's a massive arsenal.
And speaking of hardware, $10 billion. That's what Finland is currently spending to completely replace their fleet of 64 F-18s with 64 brand-new, ultra-modern American-made F-35 stealth fighter jets. This isn't just some defensive upgrade. This means they can directly rival Russian air assets across the entire northern theater.
But wait, because this brilliantly illustrates how the whole equation changes when you add Sweden into the mix. Sweden brings a 500-year-old absolute first-rate navy, complete with some of the world's most advanced submarines that are specifically designed for the Baltic Sea. On top of that, they have world-class domestic defense manufacturing. Companies like Saab are producing top-tier fighter jets and radar systems, and they also make the highly effective NLAW anti-tank missile. When you combine that high-tech arsenal with Finland's massive numbers, it creates an overwhelmingly formidable combined force in Northern Europe.
Section 4. Securing the Baltic Sea, a NATO-dominated lake. Let's shift our focus to the water for a minute, because the naval consequences of this realignment are absolutely devastating for the Russian Baltic Fleet.
You see, for years, military planners lost sleep over the Suwalki Gap. Geographically, it's this narrow 70-kilometer flatland corridor wedged between the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad and Russian-allied Belarus. Previously, this was the absolute only way to reinforce the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania by land. If a conflict broke out, Russia could quickly close this gap. One study even suggested they could do it in 60 hours, completely isolating the Baltics. But look at the new reality. With Finland and Sweden in NATO, the Baltic Sea effectively turns into a NATO-dominated lake. NATO now has the guaranteed ability to securely reinforce the Baltic states by sea and air, completely neutralizing that old nightmare of the Suwalki Gap.
Now, what's really fascinating in this theater is Gotland. It's a Swedish island positioned perfectly in the center of the Baltic Sea, and it basically acts as an unsinkable aircraft carrier for NATO. Furthermore, the Baltic Sea is incredibly shallow. We're talking an average depth of just 54 meters. So with Sweden and Finland sharing intelligence and sonar across the entire perimeter, it becomes physically impossible for Russian submarines to maintain any element of surprise. Every single movement of the Russian Baltic Fleet is going to be tracked and countered from Gotland and the surrounding shores.
Section 5. Checkmate in the north. Russia's deep fear. Because honestly, as bad as the Baltic situation is for Russia, the ultimate checkmate is happening much further north. We need to escalate the stakes here and look at Russia's absolute greatest strategic vulnerability.
Right over the Finnish border, just to the east, lies the Kola Peninsula. This is one of the most heavily militarized locations on the entire planet. It's the home of Russia's strategic deterrent against the West. It holds multiple nuclear ICBM launch facilities that can fly straight over the Arctic to hit North America. It houses the Tu-160s, the fastest operating strategic bombers in the world. It contains the vital ice-free port of Murmansk. And most importantly, it is the headquarters of the Northern Fleet, which houses advanced Borai-class submarines capable of carrying up to 96 nuclear warheads right under the Arctic ice.
So let's see how this builds into a disastrous chain reaction from Moscow. All of these incredible military assets, the ICBMs, the bombers, the Northern Fleet, they all rely on a single lifeline from the rest of Russia, the R-21 highway and rail corridor. And this twin corridor runs right through sparsely populated forests, almost immediately parallel to the new NATO border. In some places, it's less than 100 kilometers away. In a conflict, Finnish or Allied special forces could easily advance and just sever this single highway. Step 2, the entire Kola Peninsula is cut off from land resupply. Step 3, Russia's primary nuclear deterrent is completely isolated. And if that supply line is cut, Russia is backed into a terrifying corner with an impossible choice. As the source material puts it, they would be forced into a use them or lose them scenario. With literally no way to supply their doomsday weapons, their standard military deterrence up north totally crumbles, leaving an escalating nuclear response as one of their only cards left to play on the peninsula. Because of this geographic trap, Russia is increasingly forced to rely on horrifying new technologies stationed slightly further away. Enter the Poseidon torpedo. This is a massive drone-like weapon carrying up to a 100-megaton nuclear payload. It's deployed from the newly delivered Belgorod submarine, which is stationed out in the White Sea, much further away from that Finnish border. From there, it could allegedly travel 10,000 kilometers underwater, virtually undetected, to detonate offshore of coastal targets like New York, generating an unstoppable radioactive mega-tsunami.
Which brings us to a final, very precarious question. Now that Finland is part of NATO, will they follow the Norway model? Norway borders Russia, but they explicitly ban foreign troops and nuclear weapons on their soil during peacetime just to avoid provoking Moscow. If Finland does the same, it might de-escalate some of this tension. But if they don't, or if that R-21 corridor remains a constant, glaring vulnerability, Will Russia be permanently forced into a dangerous new era of relying on unstoppable underwater doomsday weapons just to maintain their deterrence? The geography has completely shifted, the calculus has changed, and the entire world is going to have to navigate this permanently altered reality. Thanks for joining us for this explainer, and we'll see you next time.